Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Jennifer and Sela, for inviting me to give this talk. For those of you who are paying attention, you'll notice that diversity was not one of the topics that Jim mentioned as an area of research of mine, so I'm sort of venturing off into the unknown here. I hope that all of you were here yesterday and heard Linda Hudson's keynote talk. In my view, it was a spectacular keynote talk and was in many ways a great introduction to what I want to talk about today. She was a pioneer in gender diversity. She was the first woman CEO of a major aviation and defense firm. She was one of 2 women who received a degree in engineering from the University of Florida in her time. And she also discussed her current work, which is on multi-generational work groups, which is a form of diversity as well. She also spoke about Lillian Gilbreth, who was a pioneer in our field. Lillian was the first woman faculty member on the faculty of engineering at Purdue, and she was the first woman to be elected to the National Academy of Engineering. Now, Linda's talk was not without fault. She set an incredibly high bar for those of us who give keynote speeches afterwards. And if I do nothing else today, I'm going to work to lower that bar for future speakers. So I think I'll be pretty successful about that. Now, normally I don't dedicate talks to anybody, but normally I don't give keynote talks either. So what I would like to do today is to dedicate this talk to my mother. My mother was also, I believe, a pioneer in gender diversity. She received a PhD in physical chemistry from MIT in 1950 and was one of, I believe, 6 women to receive any degree from MIT that year. And what she taught me really was that the only legitimate form of discrimination is discrimination that's based on the quality of somebody's ideas and what's between their ears. And that really is a prelude to the kind of diversity that I want to talk about today, which is cognitive diversity. And by way of introduction, I also want to mention 3 people that I've worked with. The first is Casey Moss, who's actually sitting midway back here. Casey's a PhD student in our department. This is not her dissertation area, but it's one of about 4 areas that she and I are working on jointly. And Anna Weiss and Vera Lowe. Anna and Vera were bachelor's and master's students in our Engineering Global Leadership honors program. They've subsequently graduated. Anna has had a particularly interesting career. She worked at General Mills for about 3 years and then decided that what she wanted to do was open a bakery. So you can go to the following website, eatmybars.com, I kid you not, and you can order baked goods from her. I would warn you though that if you go to this website, you'll probably gain about 5 pounds just looking at the website. These are outstanding pastries. So what I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit about diversity and why we should be concerned about diversity. Then I'm going to step back and ask, what is diversity? What do we really mean by diversity? And then most of what I want to talk about is, what do industrial engineers know about diversity already? And I think what we'll find is that it's an area that we already have a fair amount of knowledge about. Then I'll talk about some work that Casey and I did on how to model diversity and how to assign people to groups to maximize within group diversity and our experience in that. Now, the abstract for this said something about thoughts on a model of publishing. I don't think we're going to have time to get to that. I can talk to you later about that if you're interested. So why should we be interested in diversity? Well, the first reason is that it's morally and ethically right, I believe. Okay? Second, it's a way of correcting past mistakes and past injustices. Third, legally in the United States, we're required not to discriminate. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 states that we cannot discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Now, there have been subsequent laws as well. In Michigan in 2006, we passed the Michigan Civil Rights Initiative, which bans discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, or religion. And on the surface, that sounds like a great thing. But what it really did is it was aimed at the affirmative action programs at places like the University of Michigan. It did have some positive effects because I believe it made places like the University of Michigan think more generally about what diversity really means. So you might say, so what? None of these are reasons that industrial engineers in particular should care about diversity, and so far you're right. So let me tell you a little bit about why maybe we should in particular care about diversity. And I want to talk about a study that was done by Herring, published in 2009. He looked at data from 1996 and 97 for 506 for-profit companies, and he was concerned with things like racial and gender composition of the workforce and their impact on such output measures as sales revenue, the number of customers that a company has, their market share, and their profitability. And he was able to control for a number of exogenous factors like the business sector the company was in, the organization type, the age of the company, the region in which they operate, and the company size. Now, Herring had basically four major hypotheses, and those hypotheses really were that race and gender were positively, racial and gender diversity were positively related to sales, increased sales, increases in the number of customers that a company has, their market share, and profitability. And what he found generally is that racial and gender diversity do correlate with enhanced corporate profitability and performance, even after we control for all those exogenous factors like company size, the region in which the company operates, the industry in which the company is operating. The one where there was not statistically significant relationships were between market share and gender diversity. In another more recent study, McKinsey & Company in 2012 looked at data from 2008 to 2010, and they looked at 180 publicly traded companies in the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. And they were concerned with diversity on the executive board of the company. And they were looking at the number of women, or the percentage of women, and the percentage of foreign nationals on the executive boards of these companies. And they had two output measures that they were concerned with. The first was return on equity, and the second was the earnings before interest and taxes. And what they did is they compared companies that were in the top quartile of diversity with those that were in the bottom quartile with respect to diversity. And what they found when they did this comparison is that the return on equity for the companies in the top quartile was 53% higher than it was for those in the bottom quartile. In terms of the earnings before interest and taxes, those at the top quartile were 14% higher than those in the bottom quartile. So again, gender and national origin diversity in the executive board correlate with enhanced corporate performance. So what I would argue is that if engineers make things and industrial engineers make things better, and if we are really all about improving organizational workforce performance, then we as industrial engineers should be concerned about diversity. And diversity should be one of the arrows in our quiver of tools. But it's important to remember that diversity and non-discrimination are not the same thing. Non-discrimination may be a prerequisite for diversity, but it is not at all the same thing as diversity. So let me turn now to what is diversity. So in one study, they looked at sort of three circles of diversity. And we generally think mostly about the inner circle, maybe about the next circle that I'll show. So this inner circle talks about gender diversity, physical and mental ability and your diversity along those lines, racial diversity, and age diversity. Those are the easy ones. Those are the ones that are very easy to pick out. It's very easy to tell roughly how old somebody is, though despite that introduction that Jim gave, I'm only 28 years old. So these are pretty easy to figure out. The next level is perhaps a little bit more difficult, and that deals with things like religious diversity and your belief system, what your social class is, your sexual orientation, your ethnic heritage. And then there's the outer circle of diversity, which includes such things as your experience and your functional knowledge, your communication style, your cultural background, your political beliefs, your role in the family and your status in your family, your role in an organization, the level of that you are in that organization, where you were born, where you currently live, where you have your citizenship, the community relations that you have established over time, your expertise, your income, your health status, the languages that you speak and what your first language was, and your education and training. All of these contribute to diversity in one way or another. Now, much of what I want to talk about is really based on a book called The Difference by Scott Page. I want to talk about this because I think that Scott Page has really done some amazingly deep thinking about what diversity really means. I'm not talking about it just because he's a colleague at the University of Michigan and a fellow faculty member. The subtitle of this book is How the Power of Diversity Creates Better Groups, Firms, Schools, and Societies. So let me try to give you my interpretation of what Scott Page is talking about. He's really talking about cognitive diversity. And there are 4 factors of diversity that he argues contribute positively to workforce performance and the performance of groups. The first is the perspectives that someone brings to a problem. How do you view problems? How do you think about problems? The second is, what are the heuristics that you use to attack problems? How do you decide, what to do next? Okay. Third is, how do you interpret data and how do you interpret the world around you? And the fourth are the predictive models. All of these characteristics or components of diversity contribute positively to improve performance, according to Page. Now, there are some characteristics of diversity that do not contribute positively to workforce performance, and we'll talk a little bit about those. Most prominent among those are preference diversity, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, leading into cognitive diversity, and the factors that lead to cognitive diversity are things like training and one's experience. And only to some smaller extent does identity diversity, meaning things like your race, your gender, your sexual orientation perhaps, only those at a lesser extent perhaps contribute to cognitive diversity. So Page would argue, I believe, that we should really be looking at this entire picture of diversity, when in fact most of what we do is we look at the inner circle and maybe the next ring of diversity, and we tend to ignore many of the factors in this outer level of diversity. Now, to summarize Page's work very succinctly, I think he would argue that when it comes to decision making and problem solving, a group is going to do better than an individual, and a diverse group is going to do better in turn than a randomly selected group or some group that has certain characteristics in common. But this only applies to hard problems, okay? So these are problems in prediction and problems in problem solving. I don't think that Page or I would argue that having a diverse group of workers at McDonald's flipping hamburgers is going to lead to a tastier hamburger. That's not what we're really talking about. We're talking about problems that are hard, problems that are difficult, problems that require a lot of thought. There's one other influential book that I want to recommend to you, and that's called The Wisdom of Crowds by James Surowiecki, and these are sort of related books. So I would recommend both of those to you if you have time this summer for some summer reading. So let's now turn to what engineers, industrial engineers in particular, know about diversity. And I have to apologize for this next slide. This next slide probably has more math in it than all the rest of the presentation combined, but we'll work our way through it. So let's look first at group decision making. So we want to know, we want to ask the question of what is the probability that when a group makes a decision that the group is right about whatever they're making a decision on. So you can think about a jury making a decision, if you will. And we know how to calculate that, at least as long as it's the decision of the jury is basically based on the majority. We're not requiring unanimity. And that's just the probability that the majority is right, that most of the people get the right answer. So we can calculate this probability conditional on the probability of any one individual being right, being greater than 0.5. And what you get is a graph that looks something like this. So this plots on the vertical axis the probability that the group is right. On the axis that runs sort of left to right, we have the group size, and on the axis that runs into the screen, we have the probability that any individual is right. And what you find is that, not surprisingly, is that the probability that the group is correct in the decision that they have to make goes up with the group size and with the probability that any individual person is correct. But what's important about this is that the probability that that individuals have to be able or capable of making good decisions. The probability that an individual is right has to be greater than 0.5. So just having a diverse group of people does not in itself guarantee better outcomes. We can't expect that if we ask people to give us some insight on whether or not P is equal to NP, and we got a group of US historians in the room, that they're likely to give us a good response to that question. And even if we made that group diverse, and we added a bunch of English majors and French majors and political science majors, that would be great diversity, but none of them are particularly capable of giving us any insights into that. In a sense, P is less than 0.5 for them, so adding more people is not going to help us there. Another issue that Page talks about is the following basic rule, and that is that the group error, we're talking about squared errors here, the group error is equal to the average individual error minus the average individual error about the group prediction. Now, if you think about this for a little while, Page doesn't go through the math of this, but basically, this is nothing more than analysis of variance revisited. I'm going to spare you the math on this. So, Page looks at an example with the NFL draft. I decided to replicate Page's results and extend them a little bit, and I looked at the 2014 NBA draft. So these are the top 10 players in the 2014 NBA draft, about a year ago. I've highlighted Nick Stauskas, mainly because he's a Michigan player, or was a Michigan player, so it's important to give credit where credit is due. And then I looked at 12 organizations that predicted who was going to go where in the draft. So Draft Express, and these are listed here, Draft Express actually had the closest prediction. They were the best. And Bleacher Report was the worst of all these groups. ESPN came in third, NBA.com came in ninth, CBS Sports was 10th, and so on. Fox Sports was 5th. And here are just some of the logos of these different groups, so not very exciting. All right, so this is what you get, okay? The green line here represents the group error. And then what I've done is I've plotted the individual errors, they're squared errors, for each of these individual groups, in these groups that are doing these predictions, the 12 groups. On the far left is Draft Express. They're the only ones that did better than the group. All the others did worse than the group, okay? So what it suggests is that each of these predictors is worse than the group, with the exception of Draft Express. So again, group predictions are better than individual predictions. What I then did is I said, let's imagine that we now had 5 omniscient predictors. These are people who know exactly who's going to go in what order. And we add them to these 12. And we add them successively. What you see in the blue line is the group error. And clearly that group error, the squared error, goes down as we add these perfect predictors. Well, that's not very exciting. That's exactly what we would expect. But then I said, let's add 5 perverse predictors. So these are people who also know who's going to go in the top 10, but they predict in exactly the wrong order. Okay? So the person who actually went number 10th, they predict would go number 1. The person who actually went number 1, they predict would go number 10. And what's interesting here is that when you add them, the group error also goes down, at least for a while. So the group error goes down as long as you have 3 or less of these perverse predictors, because what's happening is that the group diversity is going up faster than the total of the individual errors. And then after a while, when you add these really perverse predictors, things get worse overall. And then finally what I did is I said, let's look at what happens if we add random predictors. So these are people who know who's going to go in the top 10, but they don't know who's going to go where, so they just pick some random numbers, and they sort of see who's going to, for each of these people. Well, what happens here is that, again, the blue line goes down as we add these random predictors. And so what's happening again is that the diversity of the group is more than offsetting the increase in the randomness associated with these predictions. Now that doesn't go on forever. By the time you get out to 50 on the x-axis, 50 of these random predictors added to the 12 websites that did these predictions, things get actually worse. So the group error is less than the expert group, the group of 12, until we get to about 35 of these random predictors. Okay? So the bottom line on this, again, is that a diverse group is likely to do better than a group of maybe experts. We'll see this again in a minute. And that, in turn, is going to do better than individuals when it comes to prediction. Let me now turn to problem solving, and I want to tell you about what I found to be a truly fascinating experiment that Scott Page did and that I have replicated, and I'll show you some of those results. So here's a problem that he looked at. We can think about a ring, and the ring has 2,000 positions on it, and they're indexed from 0 to 1,999. Associated with each of these positions is the value of that position. And the value is drawn from a uniform 0 to 100 distribution. So if you happen to have a position that has a value of 100, that's the best possible position. The value of 0 is the worst. And then he created agents. And each agent is endowed with a heuristic. And the way the heuristic so the heuristic is a triplet of discrete random numbers drawn from a uniform 1 to 12 distribution. So a heuristic might be 4, 3, 11. And let me tell you what a 4, 3, 11 heuristic is. Basically what it means is that the agent is going to start at some position x. And the agent will then look at the value at that position and compare that to the value at position x plus 4. If the value at position x plus 4 is greater than where the agent is then, at that point, the agent will move to position x plus 4 and then repeat the whole heuristic. If the value at position x plus 4 is not better than where the agent is, the agent will look at position x plus 3 and ask whether that's better than where the agent is. If it is, the agent moves to position x plus 3. Otherwise, the agent says, let's look at position x plus 11. If that's better than where the agent is, he moves there, and so on. Eventually, the agent is going to get stuck, and the agent is not going to do any better, be able to do any better. So what you can do is you can start each of these agents at all the 2,000 possible starting points and average their value, and that gives you the value for that agent or for that heuristic. Okay? Then we can talk about teams of these agents. So if you have a team, let's say, of n agents, you start by letting agent 1 go as far as he or she can go. When that agent ends and can sort of raise up his or her hands and says, I can't do any better, then agent 2 takes over. And agent 2 says, okay, let me have a try at this. So agent 2 then applies his or her heuristic. Eventually agent 2 is going to get stuck, and you keep going until you get up to agent n. When agent n gets stuck, you go back to agent 1, and you keep doing this until the entire team is stuck. Okay? And you stop when no agent can improve the solution. So here's the basic experiment. You're going to generate this circle with 2,000 numbers. You're going to generate a population of 1,000 agents. And you're going to then evaluate each of these agents. So we know which agents are the best, which agents are the worst, which heuristics are the best, which heuristics are the worst. We're then going to create a team of the best 10 agents. Now it turns out that this is a little bit like the birthday problem. In the birthday problem, you need about 23 people in the room to have a probability of 0.5 of having 2 with the same birthday. Here, this is like a birthday problem, but instead of having 365 days in the year, you have something like 1,700 some odd days in the year, because you have 12 different possible heuristics for each of these positions, or values for each of these positions. So it's something like 12 cubed. But in that case, you need only about 50 to have about a 50% chance of having people with the same heuristic. So we guarantee that they do not have the same heuristic. So we pick people who have different heuristics, but are in the top of this list. And then we also picked a team of 10 random agents. Okay, we just picked them randomly from this population of 1,000. And what we want to do is compare their performance and see how well they do. And then we're going to repeat steps 5 and 6 10,000 times. Okay? And then we repeat steps 1 through 7 10,000 times. Now, to make this story complete, we need to look at the diversity of pairs of agents. And the diversity is basically the number of positions with different heuristic values divided by the total number of positions in the heuristic. So there are 3 positions in the heuristic. If I have a heuristic that says 1, 2, 3, and Sela has a heuristic that says 4, 5, 6, then we're completely different, and our diversity, relative diversity, is 1. On the other hand, if my heuristic is 1, 2, 3, and Sela's is 3, 2, 1, then we share that second position, the 2, in common, and so our diversity is 2/3. If my heuristic is 1, 2, 3, and hers is 1, 2, 3, then we are not at all diverse in any way. And the group diversity is going to be measured as the average of the individual pair diversities for the group. So again, what we're doing is we have 2 teams. We have the top 10 agents, so you can think about these as your Harvard MBAs. These are the folks, you know, who spent $200,000 on their Harvard MBA. They are the great agents, and we're going to compare them with a random group of 10 agents. You can think about that as 10 undergraduates from randomly selected industrial engineering programs. And we're going to see how they do. Okay? Well, here's a sample of the results. So the columns compare the best 10, the team of the best 10, those are our Harvard MBAs, with our industrial engineering undergraduates, the random 10. And as you can imagine, the initial starting value for the Harvard MBAs is better than it is for the industrial engineering undergraduates. They've spent $200,000 on their education. It should be a little bit better. Okay? But what's interesting is the next 2 lines. The final value is about 1 point better. Remember, the maximum value you can have is 100. The final value is about 1 point better for our industrial engineering undergraduates. Okay? And furthermore, the diversity measure is about 0.1 better. And remember, the diversity goes from 0 to 1. So they are more diverse, and because of that increased diversity, they tend to do better. So let me show you some more results when you do this 10,000 times. What this does is it looks at the distribution of the average individual differences. So now we're comparing the starting positions of the random team, the industrial engineering undergraduates, versus the Harvard MBAs. And I wouldn't worry too much about the x-axis, but the 0 on that is pretty far to the right, and everything in the next couple slides that's in red is negative. So what this shows is that on average, the random team or the industrial engineering undergraduates start out 1 point below the best team. So they start out with a disadvantage, as you would imagine, because the best team is the one that we're picking to be the best. This shows diversity, and so on average, the industrial engineering team is more diverse than is the best team. The difference is about 0.06. And more importantly, the industrial engineering team, the random team, is more diverse in over 95% of the cases out of these 10,000 trials. And here's the bottom line. If you look at the performance after each team plays out this game, the random team beats the Harvard MBA team in almost 94% of the cases, and they beat them on average by 1 point. So again, they're more diverse, and because of that diversity, they bring different perspectives, different heuristics to play in this problem, this artificial problem, and they're able to do better. This next slide looks at the improvement, that is from the beginning to the end, for the random team and the best team, and that's what's plotted on the y-axis, versus the average diversity. And this looks kind of like a blunderbuss shot, except that when you run an R-square, a line through this, you get an R squared of about 0.24, which is nothing to write home about, except that these coefficients, in particular the 10.439 coefficient for diversity, is incredibly statistically significant. It has a t-value of something like 60. It's amazingly statistically significant. Okay, so the random team improves more than the best team, and the improvement goes up with diversity. So what does all this have to say for us in industrial engineering in terms of heuristic design? One is clearly that if we have some random heuristic that's a randomized heuristic, we should be looking at multiple starts for that heuristic. That's pretty clear. Second, maybe more subtly, we should be looking at multiple heuristics and not just a single heuristic. And so maybe one way of solving traveling salesman problems would be to give these problems to students who don't know an awful lot about them and ask them to describe how they would solve this problem. And if we did that with a class of 50 students, we might get half a dozen or a dozen very different heuristics. And then we could implement those heuristics and take the best of each of those heuristics. And finally, I'm a fan of genetic algorithms. I know they're not very popular in the operations research world, but I think they're a very powerful tool. And what it says is that we need to remember that in things like genetic algorithms, we need to introduce diversity into the population. And typically that's done by operators like mutation and importation. Let me turn to one other example of heuristics, and I need to credit my colleague Viswanath Nagarajan, who pointed me in the direction of this paper by Clyde Levy and some of his colleagues. They looked at what's called the one warehouse multiple retailer inventory problem. So the problem basically is this. You have a warehouse which is going to be supplying retailers, some number of retailers. The warehouse has a time-dependent ordering cost, so it depends on when they order. The cost depends on when during the horizon they order. There's time-independent ordering costs and daily demands associated with each of the retailers, and there's retailer-specific and time-specific holding costs throughout the system. And what you're trying to do is to ask when you should order at the warehouse from a supplier that's not shown here in this diagram, and at each of the retailers to minimize the total cost. So what Clyde Levy and his colleagues did is they formulated this as an integer programming problem, and then they solved the linear programming relaxation of that. And then they applied two heuristics to convert that linear programming problem to a feasible solution. So the first heuristic basically was a way of rounding the linear programming relaxation using method A, which we'll call method A. That they converted to an integer programming feasible solution, and that has a performance bound of 2. So what that means is that in the worst case, the ratio of the objective function that you get using this method to the true optimal objective function, which we don't know, function value, which we don't know, is 2 or less. Now that might not seem like a very impressive number, but for those of you who deal with heuristics and algorithm design, having any kind of constant performance is a pretty good thing, and having a ratio of 2 is a great thing. Okay? They then did the same thing using a slightly different rounding algorithm. They rounded the LP relaxation using method B. They converted that to an integer solution, and that method also gives you a performance guarantee of 2. So far, nothing very exciting. What they then did is they looked at the better of those two solutions. And what you're able to show, what you're able to prove, is that the performance guarantee that you get by looking at the better of those two solutions is not 2, it's 1.8. So again, 2 heuristics are better than 1. Okay? So that's basically sort of the positive side associated with diversity. Let me turn to some of the downsides. So I want to consider 3 people who I've not so randomly named Vivette, Tamar, and Karen. That's my wife and my 2 daughters. And we're going to look at their preferences for fruits, let's say. Okay? So Vivette prefers apples to bananas, and she prefers bananas to oranges. Tamar, on the other hand, prefers bananas to oranges and oranges to apples. Karen, our younger daughter, prefers oranges to apples and apples to bananas. Okay? Now the problem, for those of you who are familiar with this, is that preference diversity can lead to Arrow's impossibility theorem. And what that means in this case is that if we gave them pairwise votes, and we said to the three of them, which of you would prefer apples to bananas? Babette and Karen prefer apples to bananas, so they'd vote for apples over bananas. So far apples are better than bananas. Tamar's left out of this one. And then we asked them, what about bananas versus oranges? Well, now Tamar gets to vote again, and she says, well, I prefer bananas over oranges. In fact, they're my first and second choice. Babette says, actually, they're my second and third choice. I prefer bananas over oranges. So again, bananas are better than oranges. And then we go do one more pairwise comparison. We say, let's look at oranges versus bananas, okay? And for oranges versus apples. And in that case, Karen says, oh great, my first choice is oranges, my second choice is apples. And Tamar says, well, that's actually pretty good for me too. I prefer oranges over apples. So what we get is this cyclic relationship that says that apples are better than bananas are better than apples, than oranges, and oranges in turn are better than apples. So when you have preference diversity, you can get this sort of cyclic problem. And that can lead to all kinds of perverse behavior in gaming on the part of the players. So this is not a good thing. It's one of the downsides of certain types of diversity. One of the important points that Page points out in his book is that we need to distinguish, though, between fundamental preferences, those are preferences for outcomes, and instrumental preferences, those are preferences for how we get to those outcomes. So we're about to enter, well, we're not about to, we are in the middle of a major campaign in this country. And what you will not hear any of the candidates, even when we get up to 20-some Republican candidates, which we're likely to do, you will not hear any of them saying, you know, I am the economic slowdown candidate. I think the U.S. economy should slow down. We don't need economic growth. None of them are going to say that. They all agree on that fundamental preference. None of them are going to say, I believe that the United States should have more sick people. We have too many healthy people. I am the sick person candidate. None of them are going to say that. They all agree that we should have improved health in this country. What they disagree on are the paths, the instrumental processes that we use to get there. So they disagree on things like the impact of increasing the minimum wage. And some people will say that if you increase the minimum wage, then people have more money, that leads to more spending power within the economy, and the economy will grow. Others will say that if you increase the minimum wage, that companies are going to be forced to lay off employees, and we'll have more people on unemployment and less spending power in the economy. But they all agree that economic growth is their overall goal. It's just an interpretation of how this particular instrumental tactic will get them there. They disagree on things like the impact of expanding unemployment benefits. Okay? But they all agree that economic growth and improved health for the population are good things. So we need to distinguish between these fundamental preference diversities and instrumental preferences. Differences are often about instrumental preferences. And it's probably important that we all remember that as we go through this next campaign. And those are caused by differences in perspectives and in the way we interpret the world around us. So overall, there is a cost associated with diversity. There's Arrow's impossibility theorem. What I haven't spent a lot of time talking about is that there are communication problems associated with diversity. So if I have a team, and I have a team of someone from China, someone from Germany, someone from Spain, and someone from the United States, and all they speak is their native language, they're not going to be a particularly effective team because they won't be able to communicate well with each other. And finally, one other point that Page makes, and I agree with, is that people often feel uncomfortable in diverse groups, at least initially. So we need to be able to manage diversity as well. So the bottom line for me is that if you have well-managed and well-designed diversity in problem-solving and prediction contexts, these hard problems, the benefits will often outweigh the costs associated with diversity. So let me now turn to how do you achieve or model diversity, how do you create diverse groups. So the first thing that you need is a diverse pool. If your pool is not very diverse, the groups themselves that you create from this pool are clearly not going to be very diverse. So in academia, that involves things like better recruitment, it involves our acceptance policies, it involves financial aid, it involves mentoring of students. All these lead to the creation of a diverse pool of, let's say, undergraduates in our programs. Then you need to have some way of assigning people to groups so that those groups end up being diverse. And there are two broad methods that I'm going to talk about. One is the maximally diverse grouping problem, and then some work that Casey and I have done on targeted grouping. And we're not the first ones to do this, by the way. And that then leads to diverse groups, and with it the attendant benefits associated with diversity. So what I want to do is focus on this middle part for a few minutes. So how are these assignments generally done? Generally, they're done by hand. Okay? Even in large problems. So back when I was at Northwestern, they had to assign freshmen to seminars, and they had an associate dean who spent, in the College of Arts and Sciences, who spent half of her time every day for 2 weeks shuffling 3x5 cards around, trying to get 1,000 freshmen into 70 seminars. And so at the end of this process, they would send letters and they'd say, you know, dear Jennifer, welcome to Northwestern. We look forward to having you here. You got your 18th choice seminar, and by the way, you owe us $40,000 in tuition. Congratulations. Not a very welcoming letter. The same was true with freshman discussion groups at the University of Michigan. All the freshmen in the engineering college had to read a particular book. They were assigned to the discussion groups, and this was done by hand. Students and families, so in this engineering global leadership program that Vera and Anna were in, they wanted to assign students to families. So these were groups of diverse groups of students who would agree to meet 3 or 4 times a year. Maybe they'd go out to dinner, maybe someone would cook dinner, maybe they'd go to an event together. But the idea was to have them mix and learn about each other's backgrounds. Okay? And then, to a large extent, my colleague Larry Seifert assigns faculty to projects in the Tower program largely by hand. Now the problem with this is that these approaches are time-consuming, and second, they're not necessarily the best. So as soon as we see these two red bullets, time-consuming and not necessarily the best, we as industrial engineers should be jumping up and down and saying, IEs can help with this problem. So let me talk about two approaches. The first is this maximally diverse grouping problem. And to illustrate this, I've created 12 people, and they are characterized by whether or not they are circles or squares, and by whether they are maize or blue, or yellow or blue. Okay? So they differ in terms of shape, and they differ in terms of color. The maximally diverse grouping approach looks at every possible pairing of these individuals. So what I've shown here is the pairing of that top red circle person with all the others, and you can see that there are 11 arrows there. And when we do this across everybody, we end up with this sort of mess. Okay? And again, a tiny little bit of notation. This problem is formulated in terms of 2 integer variables. The first looks at whether or not person P and person Q are in the same group. So you can imagine with 12 people, that's not too many variables. When you get up to 1,300 people, that starts to be a lot of variables, and we'll talk about a problem of that size. The second variable is whether or not a person is assigned to a particular group. So the size of this problem is as follows. If you have 12 people in 4 groups, you have 66 of these pairwise variables that we have to be concerned about, and 48 of these assignment variables. So here's a possible solution to this. It looks something like this. And you end up with a diverse, this is the actual solution. Within each of these groups, so each of these vertical columns represents a group. In the first one we have a yellow circle, a yellow square, and a blue circle. The diversity within each of these groups would be measured as 4, because we look at the pairwise diversity and ask, what attributes do they differ on? So if we think about the yellow circle and the yellow square, they're the same color, but they're different shapes, so they differ in 1 dimension. If we look at the yellow circle and the blue circle, Again, they differ in one dimension of color, but not in the dimension of shape. So that contributes another 1 to the diversity of that group. And then if we look at the yellow square and the blue circle, they differ in terms of shape and color, so they contribute 2 to the diversity of that first group. And if you look at this, each of these groups has a diversity measure of 4. Okay. The targeted approach, though, takes a different view. It says, let's sort of target how many people of each of these characteristics we want in each of these groups. And so here might be one set of targets. So for group A, we want to have 2 yellow people and 1 blue person. We want to have 2 circles and 1 square. If you look at this in the columns, we have 6 yellow people, 6 blue people, 6 squares, and 6 circles. Okay, so we're going to try to figure out how to assign everybody to achieve this diversity, and that's about as good as you can possibly do. In terms of the problem size, now we still have those 48 assignment variables, but we're going to look at whether we're over or under the desired level of assignments for each of these. We end up with 16 of these variables, and in the work that we did, we actually had 32 because we're looking at deviations that are more than 1 and penalizing them more. So how does this approach work? Let me give you an idea of that. We're going to start by picking 1 person at first. So we pick a yellow circle, and now for that group, in terms of the targets, we're under by 1 yellow person, under by 1 blue person, under by 1 square, and under by 1 circle. So we're going to pick another person. We're going to pick a yellow square, and that now brings us down to these values. And now we pick a blue circle, and now we have achieved everything we want for that particular group. And we're going to do that for each of these other groups. We actually formulate this as an optimization problem. We don't do this by hand. But after all this is done, what you'll see is that we have achieved the targeted levels of diversity. Now, there's another reason. There are 2 reasons for using this targeted diversity approach. One is that, as we'll see in a second, the size of the problem is dramatically smaller. The second is that there's a fair amount of literature that says, for example, that if you're forming a group of students, 25 students for a discussion group, you don't necessarily want 1 African American student in there. That student is going to feel very isolated. You want either to have no African American students or 2 or more. Okay? So you can set these targets a priori, and then you can then try to achieve these targets. So here's the solution that we get using this approach, and all of the over and under variables are equal to 0. So let me tell you a little bit about our experience. Last summer, about this time, we were asked to try to assign roughly 1,100 students, freshmen, to 29 different groups, and then separately, we had to assign another 266 to 11 groups. In terms of diversity, we looked at 6 different characteristics and 18 attributes. So we looked at gender. Clearly there are 2 attributes there. We looked at citizenship. We aggregated that down to 3 different levels of citizenship. Country of origin, either you were from the US or you were not. 7 different attributes associated with ethnicity, whether you were in or out of state, and whether you were the first in your family to go to college or not. So let's look at the larger of those 2 problems with roughly 1,100 students, 29 groups, 18 attributes. What you get is roughly 32,000 of these assignment variables, and that's going to be true no matter what you do. Okay? For our problem, we have about 2,100 of these over and under assignment variables. On the other hand, we have close to 600,000 of these pairwise variables in the maximally diverse approach. So the problem here is that we have a much smaller, about a 20-to-1 ratio in terms of the size of these problems. And we were able to solve this problem in Excel using OpenSolver, a free solver that you can add into Excel, in about 5 minutes for the larger problem. We had an objective function value equal to 0, so we achieved exactly the targeted values of diversity that we wanted, and this was then implemented by the freshman office. So we were able to give them a solution that they were able to implement. So a couple of points to remember. These are from the last chapter of Page's book. The first is that the best collections of people contain people who are both diverse and capable. So you have to have P greater than 0.5 in that other example, but it should be diverse. Looking at that example where we had this circle and we were trying to find the largest possible value. Second point that he makes is that diversity is not a property of an individual, but it's a property of a collection of people. So if we have an African American woman with a Chinese surname who's a Buddhist, she herself is not diverse. If we put her in a group, she may add a lot to the diversity of that group, but she herself is not diverse. Okay? And third, identity diversity need not imply cognitive diversity. It really should be cognitive diversity that we are striving for. So let's look at a couple of implications for industry and academia. First, I would argue that we should be trying to promote group decision making rather than having single experts. What we saw in the example with the NBA draft is that we had 12 expert groups doing this prediction. Only one of them did better than the group prediction would have done. Try to have diverse teams. Okay? So bring together people from engineering, from manufacturing, from design, from marketing, from finance, from accounting when you put together teams in industry. Do diverse recruiting. So if you're at a consulting firm and your consulting firm prides itself on recruiting from only the Ivy League, you might ask yourself, how diverse is our population of employees? Maybe we should be recruiting from other places, like the Big Ten, for example. A little bit self-serving here, but yeah, you know. Okay. We should be, if you're in industry, don't just do research and development in your own company, but collaborate with people outside of your university. Now, it may be hard to collaborate with your competitors. There are antitrust rules about some of that, but you can collaborate with universities. Multidisciplinary design teams in engineering, I think, are a great thing. For those of us in academia, I would argue that many of us should be arguing that we should get rid of senior design in all of our industrial engineering programs. Just get rid of it completely. Because the way we typically implement senior design is that we have a team of industrial engineering students working on a problem. That is not a diverse team. I would challenge any of you to find any of our graduates from 2015 who are going to a firm where the only people they are going to work with are fellow industrial engineers. They are not doing that. Rather, they're working with engineers and with people who are not engineers across the spectrum. We should be replacing senior design by some kind of multidisciplinary design teams in engineering. Linda Hudson spoke a lot about multi-generational work teams. Again, this is a form of diversity that we should be promoting. A couple of challenges for industrial engineering. First is, how do you measure diversity beyond identity diversity? Identity diversity is the easy ones. But how do you really measure diversity that's important? What aspects of cognitive diversity contribute to improved performance? What are the problem contexts in which diversity is most important? Again, flipping hamburgers at McDonald's is probably not one of those, but designing an undergraduate curriculum might be one of them. Given that we have a population, how do you maximize diversity within groups? And I think that the two approaches that I talked about today give you a good head start on that. And how do we recruit an ideal population from which to form these groups? A challenge that any undergraduate or graduate admissions officer has, and that any HR person in a firm has. And then how do we manage a group so that we get past some of the costs associated with diversity and realize the full benefits? So with that, I want to thank you. I hope that I've shed some light on this discussion. I hope I haven't left too many of you in the dark. These are two pictures I took recently since I got to this hotel. And with that, I think I would welcome any questions or comments or ideas that any of you have. So thank you.
Hi, Martin Duke from NJIT. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really informative, especially the graphs. My question is, cognitive diversity is obviously great, but a lot of times you can get people who have a very stubborn, sometimes, opinions, and how do you deal really with the possibility for people really not adjusting to each other? How do you compensate for that in your team management and project planning?
So I think that's a very good question. I think I'm actually blessed at the University of Michigan because we don't have any of those people in the IIE department. So we're very fortunate in that regard. But I think it is a challenging question. I think that one of the last questions that I had on my list is how do you manage these groups? I'm not the world's expert on that. I think it is a problem. You need to have people who are good at allowing everybody to have their say. You need to have an environment in which different opinions are respected and accepted as legitimate views. And it's a real challenge. I would say that, so Larry Seifert is the former chair of my department. His wife is in the business of running these groups. So she would probably be a better person to talk to about this than I would. And Larry would probably be better than I am. But I think it is an important challenge.